My name's Henry Sokolsky. I run the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center, and I'm co-hosting with Brian Clark from the Hudson Institute this gathering, and we hope a series of them. And the idea behind these meetings was sparked by the AUKUS deal. But it's a bit more than just talking about submarines or even the issues associated with submarines, or even a little bit more than AUKUS. At least for me, and I think for Brian as well, the AUKUS deal has sort of become an occasion to start talking about how we want to relate to our closest allies and how they want to relate to one another in the Pacific, Western Pacific, and East Asia. And I'd like to think there may be another or maybe several other AUKUS deals in the making. They may not focus on submarines. I'm kind of hoping actually they don't, but there are other things that we need to be working together on, and high-tech, cutting-edge technology collaboration and other things as well beyond that. And not just with Australia, I would say. But Australia is first, at least with regard to the high-tech, cutting-edge object that everyone can think about, which is the submarine. I think there's been a lot of cooperation with South Korea and Japan, but I think we could do more. So in that spirit, we want AUKUS probably not to fail miserably. That would not be good. Since if it's a model, if it fails, that's not such a good model. So we want to see it succeed, and then we want to see how much further we can do. So just by way of explanation, there is an essay and a website, on a website. Bailey, is it possible to show how to get, how it fits on our website for the group? There's a website for MPEC, and then there's a sub website on that website that's on, we call it Pax Pacifica AUKUS working group. So this is advertising. This is pretty shameless. This is our website. I say our because the staff is present. Yeah, they work hard on this. But if you scroll down after you get to this, there's a lot there, isn't there? You'll notice, Pax Pacifica AUKUS workshop. And we will put on there the memos that are written. And each time we have a meeting and a topic, you'll be able to go to it even if you couldn't come. And you can replay it and see what happened. We're going to post articles, and if any of you have articles, particularly in I'm afraid, this is a weakness of mine. My Asian language skills don't exist. So if there's any way you can send something that happens to be in English, or we could translate it. If you think it's very important, we'll get it translated. We'll post it. All right, and you can show where is it possible to open up the articles just so they can see? There, okay. Well, there's the last meeting, our first meeting, and there's
Pax Pacifica AUKUS news items.
Oh, there you go. I see. All right. Well, in any case, I think they get the idea. And so enough on the website. I'd like to turn it over to my able co-host, and I think Brian brings the just immense benefits to this working group because he's served in the nuclear navy, number one, and number two, he's at Hudson, and they have lots of connections, that are unique to Hudson in East Asia. So it's really a privilege to be able to work with him, and I think together we're going to be able to produce a lot better product than we would either by ourselves. So Brian, why don't I turn it over to you?
Thanks for Henry for putting this on, and thanks Bailey and the staff for putting all the work into setting this up. We started this journey, late last year in December when we did the initial workshop. So we'll do a series of these to explore some of the issues surrounding AUKUS, as Henry said, which I think has gotten far too little press and far too little attention since it was initially signed. I think a lot of people expected it to just sort of peter out. We're going to try to give it some energy because over in the DoD, they're continuing to pursue it as if this is actually a going concern. And so a couple of the issues I'll talk about here in the intro, just to say, well, for one, the nations have signed off on the agreement to transfer naval nuclear propulsion information, which is a milestone in and of itself. It's not a huge milestone, but it's something that has to be done. Congress in the United States gets a vote in whether to concur with that or not. They don't have to approve it per se, but they can veto it. So in the NDAA for this year, I would expect there's going to be some language saying that that's continued, that's allowed to go ahead. So that's the most significant development in the actual, formal workings of the AUKUS agreement, and that happened about a month ago. Also, you'll note that there were some comments from the Russian and Chinese leaders, most recently in their press conference last week, talking about AUKUS as a tool for arms proliferation in the Far East, as well as introduce or intensifying tensions between the United States, Russia, and China. So I'm sure that'll be something that comes up tonight. I don't think those concerns are well founded, but they certainly are something they're going to continue to bang on as being the argument against AUKUS, is that it tends to facilitate this Anglo-American alliance, which is attempting to drive a wedge between Asian countries that should otherwise get along fine without the US and UK getting involved. So those are two more recent developments. As Henry said, the next workshop, which we're going to do in early March, will focus on implications of AUKUS for Korea and the opportunities that might be there for a Korea version of AUKUS. What would the South Korea military government benefit from in terms of technology transfer from the United States and other European allies? So we'll talk about that in the next workshop, and some of the folks here are going to be the folks that actually speak at that workshop. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Henry. Thank you.
Okay, right. So I suppose the other thing about the next workshop, I think, we'll be focusing on how much sense it makes just to replicate AUKUS about nuclear submarines, at least in the case of South Korea, and to some extent maybe Japan as well, I hope. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The only development or piece that I'd like to kind of highlight, well, we're going to start every meeting with one or two developments that we think everyone should be focused on. There was a report in the New York Times, which was quite extraordinary. It was by Cho Sang-hoon. I probably didn't pronounce that properly. I don't know that he's here yet, and maybe he can't make it. But it was a remarkable article. It was remarkable because it was all about Korea and its plans to get a nuclear submarine, and how this had been an issue that had been picked up by the two presidential candidates. Oh, Ambassador Myler, welcome aboard. And what's remarkable, besides, Brian Clark was quoted, Toby Dalton was quoted, and so it had to be a great article because, well, these people are present, and so obviously we have to flaunt it a bit. But it was a remarkable article because, to my astonishment, that tells you how much I know about Korean politics, the conservative candidate was not particularly wild about spending money on a nuclear submarine. The progressive candidate, on the other hand, was all in. And the conservative candidate was talking about, well, we really should spend more money on surveillance capabilities in space. And I found it fascinating. And I'm not sure many Americans read through the whole article to get to that point. We hope to pick up where that discussion in the article left off. And it showed that the Koreans were a bit more serious about this possibility than I think most Americans, or for that matter, Australians or British, are quite willing to talk openly about. And it raises, in fact, the kind of problem I think, properly understood, the AUKUS deal does present. I mean, we'll hear tonight a kind of diserata, and I've made sure that people of different views are here, so we don't just all agree about how we think about things. But my impression is AUKUS does have serious nuclear proliferation implications. They may not be, and I don't think they are, the ones necessarily getting the most attention. Now, to talk about these, and it has something to do with that article I referred you to. To talk about these, we've got the very best person we can find, and that's Bob Einhorn. And the reason he's the very best is, besides being the most diplomatic person I know, which it's amazing we still are friends, because I'm not that diplomatic and he is, but we are friends, and so that's one reason to show him off. But I think the more important one is he's got a lot of experience, with Korea, among other things, in his capacity working in the Clinton administration and in the Obama administration at pretty high levels. One as a senior advisor and one as an assistant secretary. But I think the real reason we should listen carefully is other people listen to him still. Okay. Now, not all of us get listened to any longer, so pay close attention. Bob, why don't you go ahead and sort of give your presentation? And what we're going to do is open it up. What I'd ask you to do, and my assistants, or I should say my better halves will do, is get into queue in the the participants list, the chat room. That way, there's no way they're going to let me ignore you, and it'll happen otherwise. So don't depend on me. Go into the chat room, and then I'll make sure that we go down. And all you have to do is, if you have a question, you can state it, but you don't have to. You can just say, I have a question, and that's good enough. We don't need to know what your question is necessarily. But if you want, you can put it in there too. Okay, with that as the administrivia, let's get to the meat of this meeting. Bob?
Henry, thank you very much for the introduction. Brian, Henry, thanks for organizing this, inviting me. It's good to see many old friends on the screen, including those who know about the subject of nuclear-powered submarines much more than I do. I'm going to focus on the non-proliferation implications of the AUKUS submarine deal. I won't really focus on South Korea. I'm very interested in the South Korea case, and I look forward to the discussion about South Korea next time. But this will be about non-proliferation implications more generally of AUKUS. The AUKUS deal has been criticized on non-proliferation grounds. But when the deal has been criticized on non-proliferation grounds, it hasn't been because critics fear that the deal is going to lead to Australia acquiring nuclear weapons. It's because they fear it will create a damaging precedent that would enable other non-nuclear weapon states to use naval nuclear propulsion as a cover for acquiring nuclear weapons. For example, by using a declared intention to build nuclear-powered submarines as a justification for developing an indigenous enrichment capability that would later be directed toward nuclear weapons, or by invoking Article 14 of its Safeguards Agreement with the IAEA to withdraw nuclear material from safeguards and illicitly divert that material to the production of nuclear weapons. Critics of the deal also fear that Australia's expected use of highly enriched uranium to fuel its submarines will compound this problem by increasing the likelihood of future HEU-fueled propulsion programs and elevating the proliferation and nuclear security risks of any diversion of nuclear material from these programs. And these are serious risks, but it's unclear to me how prevalent they will become. Not many countries are likely to pursue nuclear propulsion programs. Few have the technical capability and financial resources to mount such a program indigenously. And few see a compelling military need to choose nuclear-powered submarines over non-nuclear propulsion technologies. At present, there are only a handful of additional non-nuclear weapon states that have expressed an interest in nuclear submarines. Brazil, which has had an indigenous program for decades, has built a prototype naval reactor and may have already initiated discussions with the IAEA on paragraph 14 withdrawal arrangements. Iran, which has provided no evidence of a real naval reactor development program, but has used its declared interest in naval propulsion to justify a 60% enrichment level and even to threaten going to 90%. And then there is South Korea, which has a reactor development program, sought support from the Trump administration for naval propulsion, but was rebuffed, and may well seek a green light from the Biden administration when its new presidential administration takes power in May. Regarding the risks of HEU fueling, despite the insistence of some countries like the United States to continue relying on HEU-fueled naval reactors, the recent trend has been toward LEU fueling, with France, China, and Brazil all committed to LEU. And in the particular way the AUKUS project is likely to proceed, with HEU-fueled, sealed, and inaccessible reactor compartments that don't require refueling and provide little, if any, opportunity for undetected diversion, HEU fueling can even be a net non-proliferation plus. So the proliferation risks of AUKUS may not be as great as is sometimes assumed. Still, the international community, with the three AUKUS partners playing a leading role, need to do everything possible to minimize those risks. In the first place, that means AUKUS partners need to carry out their project in a way that will enable the IAEA to give highly credible assurances that no nuclear material is being diverted. Key elements of the AUKUS project have yet to be decided, but the partners seem to have in mind a black box approach under which a sealed HEU-fueled reactor would be transferred to Australia by either the United States or United Kingdom. The reactor would be integrated into a submarine constructed mainly by Australia in a way that would not provide access to the reactor compartment. The reactor would not require refueling for the life of the submarine, and the reactor, with its fuel and seals intact, would be retransferred to its country of origin when the submarine is retired from service. An approach along these lines, if eventually adopted, would greatly facilitate the IAEA job of providing assurance of no diversion of nuclear material. But given the importance of setting a very high bar for future nuclear submarine cases, the AUKUS partners need to go the extra mile in accepting rigorous arrangements for IAEA oversight. In working out such arrangements, the partners should be guided by the following principles. First, in designing the many technical and procedural elements of the submarine project, they should make every effort to build in features that facilitate the IAEA's role. Second, they should provide the IAEA the maximum level of transparency and access consistent with the need to protect genuinely sensitive information. And that may involve shrouding and other managed access techniques, as well as innovative measurement methods. Third, the goal of the AUKUS IAEA oversight arrangement should be to come as close as possible to normal IAEA accountancy and verification measures, while recognizing that some deviations from those measures will probably be needed to protect sensitive information. Where non-disclosure or non-access cannot be avoided, every effort should be made to compensate through other means, including enhanced transparency and access to less sensitive areas. Fourth, the partners should avoid specific elements in their own arrangements with the IAEA that they would object to if they were contained in arrangements involving other countries. For example, in a Russian deal to cooperate with Iran on nuclear submarines. Fifth, the AUKUS partners should seek approval by the IAEA Board of Governors for the oversight arrangements they conclude with the IAEA Secretariat. If achievable, board approval would set a precedent for future cases in which a requirement for board approval would provide leverage to persuade countries seeking nuclear submarines to accept stronger non-proliferation requirements, such as bringing an additional protocol into force. And Australia should do its part to build international support for the AUKUS deal and to set positive precedents for future cases. They should do that Australia should do that by taking unilateral steps to strengthen its own already impressive non-proliferation credentials. For example, it could commit not to pursue fuel cycle capabilities, forswear activities related to the development of nuclear explosive devices, and provide more frequent and detailed reports to the IAEA. In addition to ensuring that the AUKUS project itself is above reproach from a non-proliferation point of view, the three partners should work with other countries to promote country-neutral, regime-wide norms, guidelines, or even mandatory requirements for future nuclear-powered submarine programs by non-nuclear weapon states. Experts, including, by the way, some experts attending this meeting, have suggested a range of possible requirements that non-nuclear weapon states would have to accept. For example, bringing an additional protocol into force, receiving the IAEA's broader conclusion, foregoing fuel cycle capabilities, relying on LEU-fueled reactors, maintaining a positive non-proliferation compliance record, and accepting a black box approach for imported fuels and reactors. Clearly, some of these requirements would have a much greater prospect of international support than others. Some have very little chance of gaining a consensus. The trilateral partners should explore what the traffic will bear and what forms and instruments could be used to put in place regime-wide standards. For example, an IAEA Board of Governors resolution setting forth a list of requirements for board approval of a paragraph 14 arrangement, or less ambitiously, a list of factors to be taken into account in granting board approval. Regarding international cooperation on naval nuclear propulsion, the Nuclear Suppliers Group might consider a new guideline applicable to supplier state transfers of naval reactor fuels and technology. Or if an NSG consensus is not possible, informal coordination among an ad hoc group of suppliers on an approach to such transfers. Gaining broad international support for regime-wide, country-neutral standards won't be easy. That's very clear. In the end, cases brought to the IAEA Board of Governors may have to be considered individually and on their own merits, rather than on the basis of some regime-wide standards. And it's important to recognize that the potential risks of nuclear propulsion are already being addressed by a range of non-proliferation policies and tools that are not specifically related to the nuclear submarine problem. Among them, a diplomatic effort to encourage Brazil and other holdouts to bring the additional protocol into force. Negotiations to restore the JCPOA or otherwise roll back Iran's enrichment program. NSG restrictive guidelines on the transfer of fuel cycle equipment and technology. The continuous upgrading of the IAEA safeguard system, and possible future discussions between the United States and South Korea on how best to counter North Korea's missile-carrying submarines. So regime-wide standards should be actively promoted. But at the same time, the United States and like-minded countries should use the leverage and tools at their disposal to address the nuclear propulsion problem in a more targeted, case-by-case way. Nuclear propulsion has long been seen as a potential loophole in the global non-proliferation regime. The solution to the problem has always been deferred. AUKUS may finally stimulate efforts to close the loophole, at least to the maximum extent possible. From a strictly non-proliferation point of view, it would probably be best if no non-nuclear weapon state acquired nuclear-powered submarines. But that is probably unrealistic. For security, prestige, bureaucratic, or other reasons, some non-nuclear weapon states are likely to pursue nuclear propulsion programs. Not as many as is often assumed, but some. And so whatever the risks may be, we should try to mitigate them. And as a highly visible test case that could be used to focus international attention and establish positive precedents for reducing non-proliferation risks, we could hardly do better than the Australia deal as that test case. Now, a US official I recently spoke to put it somewhat differently. He said that if you're trying to make lemon into lemonade, you're best off starting off with a lemon like Australia. Now, for the Australians in the audience, I'm pretty sure he meant that as a compliment. So, Henry, I'm gonna stop there, and I hope you will encourage the very knowledgeable participants on the call to share their views rather than to ask questions of someone who in most cases is not,
Don't worry,
as
don't worry.
knowledgeable as they are.
I am not doing that. So you have no concerns. Everyone's going to get their chance at the base, including me. Let me start off by saying the comments about Hugh and Lou, I think, are really quite useful for focusing any discussion on those topics. I thought the dispatch of those things were quite, I'll be honest, I thought sensible. If you have a different view, please speak up. But, you know, anyway, I have to say, though, that I'm much more interested in Chablis than lemonade. And I think there's something about diplomatic service that reduces one's standards. I would shoot higher, and I'll tell you why. First, I am not as confident that the submarine game is going to be as slow as it's been. It's been pretty darn slow, and I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the past, it doesn't really promise a whole lot of candidates. However, when and if the first mover moves, whether that's Brazil or South Korea, watch out. And the reason I think that's the case is it's pretty much been that way with other things like ballistic missiles, drones, nuclear weapons, even to some extent. There's a level of excitement that occurs when one country makes the first move that others follow. And there's suppliers. That brings the next problem. The IEA and the Nuclear Suppliers Group are wonderful institutions. I've visited them, I've gone there, in Vienna and other places, but it's not such an easy place to get consensus that's very tough. You can get pretty weak consensus, but it's very difficult to get tough consensus. And right now, with the Chinese and Russians, I wouldn't think it's been made any easier recently. I think it might be very tough indeed. Now, that brings me to the last point, which is I really think we shouldn't just try to figure out what kind of agreement we don't want Russia to have with Iran. I think we need to kind of step up our game. What kind of agreement do we want that the Russians would have great difficulty striking with Iran? That following, Bob Einhorn's really candid comment that, ideally you don't really want a whole lot of countries engaging in building these things, that would be rather tough for others to meet. Now, if that's the goal, and you can tell I'm prejudiced, I like that goal, then you really want the three actors, the US, UK, and Australia, to set a very high standard, and it would be higher than getting the additional protocol. It would be more like the gold standard, which is for swearing legally, as Taiwan and the UAE has, getting into enrichment. It could be some other things to boot, but I would shoot high rather than low. Anyway, a little creative tension in the beginning. You want that, I think. And with that, no, I'm not going to direct questions. That's not fair. We're going to go by the order. And the first person is a dear friend of mine, John Carlson. John?
Thank you, Henry. I hope you can hear me. And
oh, we can.
Great. And speaking as a lemon, I would like to compliment Bob for such an excellent paper. I just want to very quickly comment on a couple of aspects. First, on verification, I think the principal issue that needs to be addressed is that it's not at all clear in the NPT itself and in NPT safeguards agreements whether the IAEA can apply verification activities to material that has been withdrawn from safeguards under para 14. Now, clearly, it's absolutely essential to reject any such argument, and I think that's the most important single aspect of an AUKUS precedent, or the action that we collectively should be taking in looking not just at AUKUS but Brazil and so on. That it's absolutely essential to establish as a principle that credible international assurance has to be provided for material that is covered by Para 14 arrangements, and that the IAEA should not agree to any arrangement that doesn't give that. Next, I want to comment on a contentious issue, which is that Australia or any other country considering nuclear propulsion should forswear enrichment. I think this is unreasonable and unrealistic. Australia has a third of the world's economically recoverable uranium, so it's unreasonable to expect that Australia would forswear any future activity involving enrichment of that material and give a monopoly to nuclear weapon states. Further, states like Brazil and Iran will not be influenced by any such gesture by Australia. I think a more sensible approach on enrichment is first to seek international agreement on no further production of HEU, definitely to make the additional protocol mandatory for anyone undertaking enrichment, whether for submarines or anything else, and to promote the concept of a multi-nation approach to enrichment and other sensitive fuel cycle activities for the future, that any new enrichment programs should be under multi-nation control rather than national control. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Yes, well, unfortunately, no one else has stepped up, so I have to stir the pot and get people to raise their hands. You know, we had these very formulations with the Shah. Didn't work out, you know. Oh, well, we'll do multinational with the Shah. I think one of the problems that the non-proliferation community has not faced is one that was raised many years ago by the RAND Corporation in the early 60s. And that is bulk handling facilities don't allow timely warning. Mm-hmm. And they still don't. And
agree.
The problem with Iran isn't whether it's high or low. It's that they have a machine that can go higher and low pretty darn quickly.
Yep.
And I think the immediate concern, you know, may not be Iran, which seems to have run the clock out. I mean, if they don't have a bomb by now, they could pretty quickly. It's other movers, and the question of the spread of enrichment facilities should be taken even more seriously than the spread of nuclear submarines, I think. Now, you know, multinational, well, okay. But like I say, the Shaw example is not terribly promising on that front. Maybe we're better people now. I don't know. Now, there we go. Thank you. I use this finally. Bob, you should. There's so much that's been said. It's only fair now.
Well, you know, John was one of the experts I alluded to who knew this issue much better than I do. I stand by that judgment. And I'm glad that he's in the audience today. I've never been a big fan of these of multilateral fuel cycle facilities. In principle, they're a great thing, but in practice, they're hard to work out. And maybe one reason I have a jaundiced view of this is when Iran indicated that it's prepared to participate in a multilateral enrichment facility. But I had a jaundiced view of it because their idea was that they would retain their national enrichment program, but they would also participate in a multilateral one on their territory, and which was not a great deal. Anyway, you know, it's complicated, and the motives for many countries wanting enrichment is to have an independent capability that it could turn one day to nuclear weapons. And so, you know, I just, you know, I'm dubious that that's a solution to the problem. I would agree with him. I mean, I wouldn't try to make the gold standard as a necessary basis for pursuing a nuclear-powered submarine program. But I disagree with him on Australia. I don't see why Australia couldn't simply say, yeah, we're a uranium exporter. That's very important to us. But we have no intention, we have no interest in an indigenous enrichment program, and so we're going to foreclose that opportunity. Now, you're right. Iran is going to, not going to say, well, Australia did it. We're going to get out of the enrichment business. But I think there would be a much better talking point for use with, say, more reasonable countries like the ROK, to persuade the ROK that it really doesn't need an indigenous enrichment program, nor, by the way, a pyroprocessing program. But I think Australia could contribute to that worthy goal. And I don't see that Australia has any realistic future option for pursuing domestic enrichment. Why it would want to do so? It's hard to imagine. Anyway, you can come back. You can come back on that, John, if you'd like.
Well, wait.
Well,
we have,
let me say very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So let me say very quickly, Australia does not have any such plans. So I don't want to give the impression otherwise, but I really do think it's more productive to think in terms of how should the enrichment business be conducted in every country in the future, given what Henry said is absolutely correct, that any country that has enrichment has the capacity to produce nuclear weapons at very short notice. So this is an issue not just for countries that are thinking about enrichment, it's an issue for existing enrichers, including the weapon states themselves, when they take the disarmament obligations seriously. Thank you.
Let me follow up, and then Toby, I promise, you're next. I think you're raising how much the little AUKUS problem becomes a big problem. I always say small steps for small people. I know that we may not have to sprint to the finish line on all of this, but I think it's useful to talk about, because I think you're right. The United States has a multinational enrichment plan. That's all it's got. And it seems insistent on trying to figure out how to have its own national one. I think that's a mistake. Maybe partly because of commercial things, but also for the point you raised. There's no reason why we can't have a multinational supplier for the things we need. We don't need, we could even negotiate, dare I say it, probably an agreement with Urenco to produce, oh my God, HUE for the naval program. But we put it out of our mind. We shouldn't. We should try first, for the reason you raised. So, by the way, that is a point that Mr. von Hippel has made a career out of, and I think he's right. He's right. So don't be quiet on that front, okay? Toby, yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks, Bob, for a good and provocative paper. I guess I wanted to throw in kind of one other angle as I've been thinking about this, and then I actually have a follow-up question for John as well. So the other angle is that the facts of the case, I think, lend perceived legitimacy to possession of HEU by non-weapon states in ways that hasn't been the case in the past, or at least to the same extent. And not only in the military realm, but in other realms as well. And so I think we're kind of at the cusp of a tipping point in efforts to minimize HEU. Whereas in the past, there's been a lot of effort to try to convert research reactors from HEU to LEU. Now I think the sense that HEU may be a valuable commodity again, not just for naval propulsion, but perhaps in the future also for space propulsion or in other ways. The legitimacy that the US has given to this idea by cooperating with Australia, I think is something that we ought to be concerned about. It's a precedent that hasn't been as much remarked on. My question for John, you've got vast expertise and experience on verification issues. So Australia is one of a few states that has gone through the broader conclusion process. And my understanding is that it can be time consuming and probably a little bit painful for the people involved. I'm curious for your thoughts and reactions to proposals that Australia should do even more in terms of transparency than it has done already to achieve a broader conclusion with the agency. To include more frequent declarations or more frequent physical inventory verification and inspections, these kinds of steps, and how those are being seen in the debate there. Thanks.
Can I respond, Henry?
Yes.
I think in principle, and we've demonstrated this, Australia has demonstrated this over some decades, we are definitely prepared to go the extra mile with the agency. A lot of the additional protocol procedures were trialled in Australia. What we would need to do is to sit down with the agency and find exactly what it wants to do in order to build up its coverage of acquisition paths that would be related to this new activity, the running of nuclear-propelled submarines. And I think I could confidently say that issues of access, wide area environmental monitoring, and so on, Australia would be perfectly happy to discuss and proceed with. I don't really see that's the issue. I think what's more of an issue is the one I touched on at the beginning, that at the moment there's a very big question mark about what kind of verification the IAA is entitled to do in the Article 14 area, and that's where I think it's absolutely essential to establish a strong precedent as quickly as possible.
Well, so many. Oh, here we go. Judgment. Please proceed, Mr. Kang, Professor Kang, Dr. Kang.
Thanks, Bob, for your excellent talking. I have a question for you. Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute has been developing a non-military purpose marine reactor for recent years under the name of ARA project. What problems will rise if it is applied to submarine in future?
Well, I'd want to ask a number of questions about that. I do know that after 2017, the President Moon administration approached the Trump administration to seek support. I'm not sure what exactly they asked for, whether it was just a kind of a green light, whether they wanted naval reactor technology, fuel technology, what they were really interested in. That would be, very important. An important question I would have about using this, what do they call it, ARA, or this SMR project for naval propulsion. A critical question is, how are you going to get the enriched uranium for it? Are you planning to, in South Korea, enrich the uranium or import it, or what? I would be pretty negative if the idea was to have a strictly indigenous program, including the enrichment of the uranium for the fuel. So I'd be very interested, and maybe at our next session we'll have a deep discussion about this, is how South Korea would go about its nuclear powered submarine project. Maybe Jungmin, maybe you have real insights into that you could share with us.
Yeah, the ARA project, that Kerry has been performing now, use ADU fuel, 19.75% ADU fuel. They import the 19.75% ADU from Russia. So it was reported to IAEA, and on the purpose of development of a marine reactor, like icebreaker or other proposals. So they denied to develop for submarine purpose. Anyway, it's now completely peaceful purpose. So that my question was, as I said today, if they convert it in the future, in case, what happened?
Bangju Jung, you have your hand up. Why don't you proceed?
I want to say a couple. I want to make a couple comments. First, this kind of ideas of using a reactor for this kind of other purposes was out there for a long time. It was very slow in making. It may be true again, or maybe during the last Cold War era, U.S. and the Soviet Union was kind of controlling everything. So it's no use for them to smaller countries to have them. And then in the post-Cold War era, there was political scientists saying that there was a U.S. hegemonic system. So there was almost this arms race, and the power politics was gone. There was no use of pursuing them. But nowadays, people are saying this, history was returning, and geopolitical competition returned, and that there is a series of power politics going on. So this completely new environment might accelerate all these efforts by either Australia or South Korea or any other countries to try to obtaining those capabilities. So it's a kind of I want to say is that the environment is changing. It could be accelerated. And my second point is that this AUKUS Australia's case is crossing multiple red lines, just not one. One is about the HEU use was is spreading, as Toby Dalton said, and also this is the first case of non-nuclear weapon state is acquiring nuclear propelled submarine case, and it was another red line was that the U.S. have never provided any military use of nuclear technology, but that was broken. So I think any one of these, if only we want to, have this pursue this nuclear-free world in the future, we need to have this multiple overlaid, kind of red lines so that it could slow down, all aspects of. But now this AUKUS case is breaking several of those red lines. So the situation could be worse. And my question is that for example, South Korea could be it's trying. There is a serious debate in South Korea. Bob said that in Korea, progressive government is more interested in nuclear submarine, and our conservative government is less interested. My explanation for that is that our conservative government has U.S.-Korea alliance first policy. So it's not going to really go against what the against the U.S. alliance. And also, in that case, they are more relying on what more of a complementary, U.S.-Korea military forces. But as you know, on our progressive government are more interested in autonomous defense policy, autonomous diplomatic policy. So, assuming some cases that could be much loosened alliance, or assuming there is some regional conflicts among South Korea and the other regional countries. So Korea want to have a more of an autonomous defense capabilities. In that case, our aircraft carriers or nuclear propelled submarine could be one of the options. That could be one of my explanation, but my Korean colleagues could add that. And my question to you is that what if Korea is pursuing nuclear propelled nuclear submarine, but using LEU capabilities? Is that going to be more acceptable to others, people here? And my first question. And second question is that, if that's a much better than, less worse than the, HU or nuclear submarine that the USA is thinking to provide to Australia, why don't, US, Australia, or South Korea is developing jointly, nuclear LEU used reactor that could be used for submarines or any other, ships. In this era of, climate change, there is some strong demands to change all those diesel-fueled big ships, civil merchant ships, to use nuclear reactors, LEU reactors. They could be less damaging to the climate. So is that could be one of the possible options that we could be? It's not the best, but it's not the worst.
You need to stop because we have to.
Yeah, I will stop there.
You have generated an entire panel discussion rather than an answer. And when you start talking about global warming, people start running underneath the chairs and they start shaking because it opens up the universe of possible discussion. Why don't, given the time and our desire to make sure no one feels like this goes on endlessly, Professor Lee, we'll take your comment and then we'll close out. And we'll combine your comments with the ones.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be brief. My question overlaps a little bit with the other Korean commentators.
Okay.
But my first question, Bob, how do you evaluate Biden administration non-proliferation policy? And it goes with the AUKUS deal. In other words, how much do you believe AUKUS deal is in line with a traditional U.S. non-proliferation policy? I'm asking this because some people say that this may be a signifying a change to conditional or controlled proliferation to allies. And another question is that you mentioned that there are some non-nuclear weapon states that aspires to have a nuclear propulsion in their submarine. But eventually the decision may be a case by case. But think about the Korean case. Korea is already threatened by North Korea's nuclear weapon and submarines. And what's that criteria that U.S. government is making decision on case by case? Do you believe South Korea is a little more likely to have that in the future? And my final comment is that, as Dr. John already mentioned, there's a serious controversy in debate in South Korean presidential race these days about light aircraft carrier and nuclear submarine, etc. But I would say more conservative people are more concerned about the immediate threat, deterring North Korea threat and North Korean missiles and submarines. So in a sense, light aircraft carrier or submarine is a kind of a weapon that is designed to have a power projection. But where South Korean Navy goes beyond the Korean Peninsula. So that's the one of the controversy, I think. Let me study.
Well, I want to give Bob Einhorn a chance to comment, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, just to to answer Mr. Lee, does the Biden administration have a conditional approach to nonproliferation? But by that, I assume you mean, it has a rigorous nonproliferation approach for certain countries like Iran or North Korea, but less so with respect to others like allies. Or do we even distinguish between an ally like Australia and an ally like South Korea? That may be your question. I think the approach has been pretty consistent across the board. I don't think, and we don't have a spokesperson for the Biden administration here, but I don't think the administration believes it's compromising its nonproliferation goals with the AUKUS deal. It believes that even with HEU fueling, the highest standards of verification can be achieved. And I think it doubts that there will be, great replication of this project with other non-nuclear weapon states. Maybe it's naive about that, but I don't think so. And of course, every administration, every U.S. administration makes, non-proliferation is not the only U.S. goal. You have other U.S. goals, and in the AUKUS case, you had both the need for a geostrategic alliance on nuclear submarines with Australia, especially given the China threat, and that was traded off against other goals. And I think the administration said publicly that the AUKUS was a one-off deal, not to be replicated. I think that was wrong. I think other U.S. allies face their own security predicaments, not least, of course, South Korea. And whether nuclear-powered submarines is the answer to that security predicament, I don't know. But I think my own view is the Biden administration should approach the question of a nuclear-powered submarine for South Korea with an open mind and look at whether it should be pursued, and if it should be pursued, the kinds of arrangements that would attach to that kind of project. But I think this is just this is something for our future sake. Let me just say one word about what I call the HEU paradox. I think Toby Dalton is exactly right. We want to minimize the use of HEU, and not just for military projects, but for civilian projects as well. But the paradox, as far as submarine fueling is concerned, is that at least for the time being, and probably for the foreseeable future, you're not going to have a lifetime LEU core that doesn't require refueling for the life of the reactor. When you have an LEU reactor, you're going to have to refuel it, and that's going to create opportunities for diversion that won't exist in the AUKUS situation. So it's a kind of a paradox. But I do sympathize with Toby's reaction that AUKUS may signal a diminution of the priority placed on HEU minimization, both for military and civilian.
Let us close out and look forward to the next. The questions, the last two comments were really quite interesting. I have to tell you that the difference between Lou and Hugh is not interesting, and only diplomats That's to say people who don't really care about the technical realities make a big deal out of this. And the reason why is you can move from one state to the other very quickly. And so when you say, oh, what would you think if we did only LU reactors versus HU reactors? Not interesting so much as whether or not you're making any kind of enriched product. So that's point one. And we do not want to see that spread. And maybe the United States hasn't thought enough, or any of the other parties, about how serious it is to keep that from spreading. Maybe they say, oh, well, that's unrealistic in the end. Well, that may be, but if that's unrealistic in the end, all God's children are going to be able to get nuclear weapons pretty quickly. And I'm not sure that's a world we want. Second, I don't think we have thought in the United States enough about, as Bob, I think, was alluding to, whether we want more country neutral approaches or one-offs, a la carte. I think in the end, we're going to have to go much more in the direction of country neutral as much as we can. We've gone a la carte an awful lot. And so when we do AUKUS, it should, as I think Bob has been arguing, point in the direction of some high standard that we want as many countries as possible to follow, rather than, well, this is Australia, no one else can do what we're doing, and it's one of a kind. I don't think that's a complete thought. And I think Bob and I share that view very strongly, which is interesting because we don't agree about everything, He's smiling, he knows. So that's number. And then finally, we shouldn't be so eager to think that nuclear propulsion is the next best killer app, either in the civil sector or, dare I say it, in the military sector. In other words, the Marine argument for Australia has to do with how far away it is from where it can do some good. And for them, the nuclear submarine is a pretty strong case. It is much, 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 much weaker when you're talking about having the Japanese and the South Koreans work the closed seas and the island chain patrols. And for that, it's probably going to be looking for quite a while like the nuclear submarine is not your best bet at all, but just the opposite. And that will lead to our next meeting, where we're going to talk about what makes the most military sense for each of these countries and why they might be different. On that note, I want to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. And Brian, I guess we're scheduling something for March.
Correct. We're scheduling something for early March. We're going to try to do it in the first 2 weeks of March.
Okay.
I'm working on speakers right now.
Well, that's terrific. And you will have more of the responsibility than I will, I hope. And I want to thank you for getting us thinking about all of these things. It was a very good start. Very good start.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Brian.
Okay. And thank everyone for participating.